Have you ever wished that nothing and nobody could hurt you again? Not by becoming cold or distant, not by closing yourself off from the world, but by reaching a point where other people's actions stop shaping you before you've chosen to let them, where their words don't linger longer than you intended, and their expectations don't reorganize your inner life without consent. Most people carry this wish quietly. It feels reasonable. It feels earned. And without noticing it, many begin arranging their emotional life around it. How much they open up, how quickly they respond, how available they remain, even when something inside them is already tired. If you've ever found yourself always reachable, always responsive, always emotionally present even when your internal resources were running low, you're not weak. You're not broken. You're not unusually sensitive. You're responding in the most human way possible to a world that subtly rewards openness and quietly punishes absence. Over time, availability stops feeling like a decision and starts feeling like who you are. You don't choose to be reachable, you simply are. And that's where the pattern begins, not through intention, but through repetition that no longer asks for permission. For a long time, it feels comforting to believe that pain comes from caring too much, that you were hurt because you stayed open, because you offered your attention, your time, your emotional presence generously. That story gives suffering meaning. It frames wounds as proof of depth, as evidence of goodness. And slowly, almost invisibly, this explanation settles into identity. You begin to see yourself as someone who doesn't disappear, who remains accessible, who absorbs emotional weight because that's what being mature, kind, or evolved looks like. The world often confirms this. You're seen as reliable, supportive, safe. But there is a quieter question hiding underneath all of this, one that rarely gets asked because it destabilizes the very identity holding everything together. What if the pain didn't come from love itself, but from how accessible you became before you ever consciously chose to be? Carl Jung warned that until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. Availability, when it goes unexamined, works in exactly this way. It doesn't announce itself as a choice. It feels like character, like virtue, like emotional intelligence. Your nervous system begins to associate reachability with safety. Absence starts to feel heavier than presence, not because something bad is happening, but because something might. And so availability becomes a form of emotional regulation. Being there reduces internal tension faster than pulling back ever could. This is not a moral failure, and it's not about boundaries yet. It's a system learning what keeps discomfort away in the short term. The problem is that systems built only to reduce immediate discomfort don't ask what they're slowly eroding. When availability becomes automatic, it stops being generosity and starts becoming permeability. Your inner life reorganizes around anticipation. You sense expectations before they're spoken. You feel responsible not just for your own emotional state, but for stabilizing others as well. And because this pattern feels mature and virtuous, it rarely gets questioned. It feels like strength, like awareness, like growth. But patterns that survive by feeling virtuous are the hardest to see clearly. And the longer they remain unexamined, the more they shape what feels normal, safe, and inevitable. This is not about withdrawing from the world or becoming indifferent. And it's not about blaming yourself for how you learn to survive. It's about recognizing a structure most people live inside without ever noticing it's there. Because once you see how constant availability forms, you begin to understand why certain wounds repeat, why exhaustion becomes familiar, and why emotional safety always feels slightly out of reach. In the next part, we're going to look at how this pattern quietly solidifies into a structure you live inside, and why stepping away from it feels far more threatening than staying exactly where you are. What begins as a personal tendency doesn't remain personal for long. Repeated availability quietly reorganizes the environment around you, not through intention, but through consistency. People begin to anticipate your presence before you arrive, your response before you choose it, your openness before you feel it. The relief that once followed availability now arrives earlier, subtly confirming that staying reachable was the correct adjustment. Over time, this relief stops feeling like a response and starts functioning like regulation. You are not deciding to be available. The system is deciding for you because it has learned which version of you produces the least immediate friction. From the outside, this looks like reliability, generosity, emotional intelligence. From the inside, it feels like a low-level vigilance that never fully turns off. You begin forecasting expectations before they are spoken, shaping responses before requests are made, managing emotional exposure before contact occurs. Availability becomes a preemptive movement, a way of staying ahead of discomfort rather than meeting reality as it unfolds. And because this adjustment reduces tension in the short term, it is reinforced without being questioned. What feels like connection is often simply predictability rewarded. Carl Jung warned that what remains unconscious does not disappear, it directs. When availability becomes automatic, it slips beneath awareness and starts shaping perception itself. You don't just respond more quickly. You notice less. You narrow your field of experience to what can be managed without disruption. This narrowing feels like peace, but it is peace achieved through control rather than contact. And because nothing dramatic breaks, because nothing announces itself as loss, the structure continues to strengthen quietly. Over time, absence begins to feel heavier than presence. Not because something bad has happened, but because the system has learned that interruption carries risk. Silence starts to feel unsafe before anything has gone wrong. Delay feels irresponsible before consequences exist. What was once an option now feels like an obligation, not imposed from outside but generated internally. The most difficult part is that this structure does not announce itself as confinement. It feels functional. It feels mature. It feels like who you are. And yet, embedded within this structure is a weakness most people never see, because it doesn't reveal itself through breakdown or conflict. It reveals itself through timing, through something subtle that hasn't happened yet. That is what we'll examine next. If this is making sense to you, subscribing simply means you won't miss what comes next. Every structure that relies on anticipation rather than contact carries a weakness. It works very hard to conceal. It depends on predicting discomfort before it arrives, because prediction allows regulation to happen early, quietly, and without challenge. The relief comes not from what actually occurs, but from preventing what might. And for a long time, this works. Expectations are met before they are spoken. Emotional turbulence is absorbed before it has a chance to surface. Stability is maintained not through presence, but through preemption. But what this structure cannot tolerate is contact with reality itself, because reality does something anticipation cannot. It corrects. The discomfort you are regulating does not live in experience. It lives in expectation, in imagined reactions, imagined consequences, imagined costs. Expectation has no corrective feedback. It grows unchecked because nothing ever happens to contradict it. You don't discover whether absence would truly cause rupture, because absence rarely occurs. You don't find out whether silence would actually lead to loss, because silence is filled before it has time to exist. The structure survives by keeping you one step ahead of reality, permanently managing outcomes that never fully arrive. This is why the system becomes so sensitive around initiation. Not because action itself is dangerous, but because initiation introduces evidence. And evidence is destabilizing to a structure built entirely on prediction. Once something actually happens, anticipation loses its authority. The imagined cost is forced to confront the real one. And even if the outcome is neutral, or tolerable, or even relieving, the structure cannot afford to learn that, because learning would change the equation that has been keeping it intact. What's important here is that this weakness does not feel like a weakness. It feels like caution, like wisdom, like emotional intelligence. The system convinces you that beginning is risky, that delay is prudent, that maintaining availability is safer than discovering what happens without it. Initiation begins to feel heavier than endurance, not because endurance is easy, but because it is familiar. The known discomfort feels preferable to an unknown one, even if the unknown might be smaller. Understanding this does not interrupt the structure. In fact, awareness often intensifies it. Once you see the pattern, the pressure relocates. You begin monitoring yourself, watching your responses, tracking moments of hesitation. Awareness turns inward and becomes surveillance. The question is no longer whether you are available, but whether you are doing availability consciously enough. And that question quietly tightens the bind, because now even noticing the impulse feels like responsibility. This is why insight alone so often fails to change anything. The structure does not rely on ignorance. It relies on timing. It survives by acting before reflection has a chance to intervene, before experience can offer correction, before reality can speak for itself. And as long as anticipation remains the primary reference point, the system continues to function smoothly, efficiently, and invisibly. The crack, then, is not in what you know. It is in what the structure prevents from ever fully occurring. And the more clearly this becomes visible, the more the system adapts to protect itself. Because once prediction is exposed as unstable, the entire pattern becomes vulnerable, not to effort or force, but to something far quieter. And that is what we need to look at next. The moment this weakness becomes visible, the structure does not weaken. It recalibrates. Systems built on anticipation are not threatened by awareness. They are threatened by disruption. And awareness on its own rarely disrupts anything. What it does instead is migrate inward. The regulation that once happened automatically now becomes something you monitor. You begin watching your responses more closely, tracking moments of hesitation, questioning whether silence is intentional or accidental, whether availability is chosen or compulsive. The structure survives by turning insight into oversight. This is where many people feel more stuck than before. What once felt like reflex now feels like responsibility. You are no longer just available, you are aware of your availability. And that awareness adds pressure, not freedom. Every moment becomes a test. Every delay feels deliberate. Every response carries weight. The system no longer needs to move quickly because you are doing the work for it. You anticipate not just others, but yourself. The most effective adaptation happens around repetition. A single absence can be dismissed as circumstance. Two can be explained as coincidence. But repetition introduces pattern, and pattern threatens identity. So the structure grows vigilant. It does not stop you from withdrawing once. It makes repeating that withdrawal feel dangerous. The cost is no longer imagined reaction. It is imagined meaning. What will this say about you? What will it turn you into? The structure resists not in proportion to difficulty, but in proportion to identity threat. This is why attempts to practice change often fail. The system learns. What felt possible once becomes heavier the second time. Not because the action changed, but because the narrative around it did. Awareness becomes surveillance. Intention becomes pressure. Even silence is no longer quiet, it is loaded. You cannot tell whether you are resting or withholding, choosing or avoiding. The distinction itself becomes another layer of management. At this stage, effort backfires. Trying harder sharpens the bind. Strategizing adds complexity. Even restraint begins to feel like control. The structure tightens not because it is malicious, but because it is efficient. It has learned that monitoring produces compliance more reliably than force. You remain reachable not because you want to be, but because the internal cost of not managing yourself feels too high. And slowly, something else begins to shift. Control itself starts to feel like the source of tension. Not the people, not the demands, not even the structure anymore. The constant effort to decide, regulate, track, and manage begins to register as strain. The question that forms here is no longer how to stop being available, or how to do it better, or how to make it stick. The question becomes more unsettling than that. It asks whether the need to control, to choose correctly, to manage outcomes at all, has become the very thing keeping the system alive. And if that is true, then whatever comes next cannot be another strategy. It cannot be another form of effort. It has to emerge somewhere else entirely, quietly, without instruction, and without restoring the very control that has been tightening the loop. At some point, without ceremony, the question that has been driving everything begins to lose its grip. Not because it was answered, but because it no longer organizes experience in the same way. The need to decide, to manage, to monitor every movement softens, not into confidence, not into freedom, but into something closer to absence. The system that depended on constant regulation finds less to work with, not because you fought it, but because the internal demand that fed it has thinned. What replaces effort is not clarity, it is quiet. Not the satisfying kind, not relief, not peace. More like the background noise dropping out of a room you didn't realize was loud. For a while, this feels disorienting. The urge to respond still appears, but it carries less urgency. The pressure to explain, to remain accessible, to anticipate, arrives late or not at all. When it does appear, it feels heavier than before, oddly inefficient, like repeating a gesture that no longer produces the same effect. This is not because you learned to stop being available. It is because availability stopped functioning as regulation. The relief it once delivered fades. The familiar internal reward no longer arrives on time. The system did not break. It simply lost traction. Without constant reinforcement, it weakens quietly. You are not choosing differently. You are noticing less need to choose. There is a strange emptiness here that many people mistake for loss. Without the constant work of managing perception, something feels unfinished. You may feel less defined, less certain of who you are to others. That uncertainty can feel unsettling, even disappointing. But it is not collapse. It is the absence of a structure that once provided shape by demanding effort. Identity does not rush in to replace it. No new self arrives to take control. The space remains open. In this space, nothing dramatic happens. You do not become invulnerable. You are not protected from being hurt. But the mechanisms that once amplified exposure lose their precision. You are no longer reorganized before contact occurs. Reactions happen closer to experience, not ahead of it. The system that once depended on anticipation finds fewer predictions to enforce. Life corrects itself more often than it used to, simply because it is allowed to arrive. This is not empowerment. It does not feel like growth. It does not announce itself as healing. It feels ordinary, slightly flat, and easy to overlook. But something essential has shifted. The question of availability no longer demands resolution. Control is not reclaimed. It is rendered unnecessary as a central concern. And without that demand, the structure that once governed everything quietly dissolves, not replaced, not defeated, just no longer required to keep things moving. What remains is not a new way of being, but the absence of constant self-management. And in that absence, things happen closer to when they actually occur, not before. That is all.